Welcome to Open Computational Gastronomy, Week 1, Lecture 3. Let's get started with the recap of what we did in the last class. We started by asking the question of what is cooking. I connected it with a metaphor of it being magic, it being alchemy. Further, I argued that how cooking is the very essence of being human, following the arguments of Richard Wrangham, and I also touched upon the point of it being the source of nutrition and health. Later on, we started with the notion, a very simplified notion of recipe, that of an unordered list of ingredients, and how in our lab we started asking this question of why we eat what we eat. After that, I started with the notion of food pairing hypothesis of Heston Blumenthal, and how in our lab we investigated the food pairing phenomena in the Indian cuisine. There were two take-home messages from this study. With the kind of data that we had at that point of time of recipes, ingredients, and their flavor molecules, we inferred that the Indian cuisine is characterized by a contrasting blend of pairs of ingredients, and importantly, a result which has remained very strong and consistent over a period of time is that of spices being the molecular fulcrum of the Indian recipes. Well, let's move on into the today's class, and let's look at how computational gastronomy can be leveraged for data-driven food innovations. While doing so, I would ask you to work on some simple exercises, and I would invite you to work on those and get back to me. I have already floated a Google query form asking you details of your organizational affiliation, you being a student or being a professional or an entrepreneur, as well as asking your inputs on what do you expect out of this course based on the course objectives. So without fail, do fill up the form on the Google Classroom. The three dimensions that we shall be looking at when it comes to leveraging computational gastronomy for data-driven food innovations are recipes, the data of recipes, that of the molecular constituents, primarily the flavor molecules in the ingredients, natural ingredients, and finally the health associations of dietary ingredients. Notice that without having a quality, well-curated data on all of these angles and more, one cannot build a data science out of computational endeavors, gastronomical endeavors. So let's get on with the first part, and that of recipes. Now think about it. So far I have been floating a definition of a recipe which is rather simplified. I have been saying that a recipe is nothing but a set of unordered ingredients. Well, that's a very simplified and to an extent false definition. Quite clearly, any of my chef friend would rather say, make a mockery of my definition and would say that Professor Bagler, come next time to my kitchen and I shall give you an unordered list of ingredients. Well, that doesn't really work well. Nonetheless, we started with this definition as I have been arguing that gastronomy and computational gastronomy specifically is where physics used to be in the 18th century. So we need to build a lot on it, and like physicists would go by a very simple striped down model of a cow, the so-called spherical cow model, which means essentially trying to keep the information, the data that you would like to account for while modeling an entity or a phenomena, as less as possible to begin with, understand it at a coarse level, and then keep on making it more and more refined. So we started with this notion of unordered list of ingredients and went on to get to the data of flavor molecules and the food pairing analysis. Quite clearly, you would notice that recipe is far more complex than that. Two of the major aspects that we missed out in this particular definition is that of the quantity, how much of quantity of each ingredient is going into the recipe, as well as that of the order, not to mention the processes which are going into the recipe. Now, RecipeDB is at a very primitive stage. It is not yet released, but if you would like to go through and play with it, it's available for open scrutiny and critical feedback. This is a repertoire that we are creating, which will compile as many recipes as possible from across the world cuisines. At the moment, we have more than 100,000 recipes in this repertoire from around 6 continents, 24 regions, and 84 countries. These recipes themselves are further characterized by their dietary attributes, about what kind of a dietary style they pertain to, as well as what are the different processes, cooking processes that go into it, not to mention even the utensils which are being used for the purpose of cooking. And importantly, the quantity of the ingredient, what is the unit that is being used, is there any pre-processing, we call it state, what is the temperature, is the ingredient dry or fresh, and what is the chunk size, is it finely chopped or is it has a big chunks in it, etc. All of this information, apart from the nutritional information that has been incorporated from the USDA database, constitutes the RecipeDB. In summary, we have started with a spherical cow model, and that was circa 2015, the story that I had narrated in the last class. But now we have reached a place where we have a phenomenal amount of information, while still a lot is yet to be compiled and curated and structured. This data is in a state where we can ask interesting questions. So let's see what we have been able to do with the kind of data that we have been able to obtain so far. One, going beyond the Indian cuisine and its food pairing analysis, we have investigated cuisines across the world for the food pairing phenomena in a detailed manner. And in fact, after a couple of weeks, we shall be coming back to this topic of food pairing analysis. And at that point of time, I'll be elaborating on the culinary fingerprints of the world cuisines, and will be telling you the nitty-gritties of how we go about compiling this data and analyzing it. So we shall come to that topic later. But the ability, the power of understanding cuisines at the level of an objective measure of food pairing and culinary fingerprints is very, very powerful. It encodes the information of likings and preferences of a population in a particular geocultural locus, and thereby giving us the power of understanding what are the typical patterns, preferences that these population may have. So this has, beyond having academic undertones, it does have a lot of commercial potential in terms of how it could be used for new product design or for targeting to a specific audiences. Notice very briefly, while I did not go into the statistics, and we shall be coming to that in the next week, in the second week of our course, when you look at number of ingredients that are used in the recipes across the world, turns out that it follows what is called as a Gaussian or a normal distribution, something which grows initially smoothly up and then falls down smoothly. And interestingly, the average number of ingredients that are used in recipes are approximately around 10 of them. So if we have of the order of 1,000 different ingredients that are ever possible, they could be vegetables, spices, lentils, dairy products, meat, fish, etc. All of these ingredients put together, if they are of the order of 1,000, actually the real number is far larger than that, but let's stick to this number as a ballpark figure. Then turns out that without accounting for some of the redundancy, but still for a simplified way of putting it, 10 to the power 3, that is 1,000 multiplied 10 times, will give you a number which is larger than, far, far, far larger than the number of stars that are there in the universe. So essentially what I'm proposing is that if you consider a recipe to be a combination of ingredients, for the moment leaving out other constraints of what processes and what quantities they can contain, they can have, turns out that the number of recipes that you can actually concoct, the combinations that you can make, is humongous. It's astronomical. Can we really cook all of these recipes? Will all these recipes be palatable? Quite clearly not. It turns out that within the universe of these stars, you will have certain galaxies, which means a certain geocultural culturally constrained bunch of recipes which follow a certain pattern. Well, the job here is to characterize the regional cuisines, cultural preferences as they are, and mine from an astronomical number of recipes that pertain to a specific cultural lock-in or patterns lock-in. So this is one of the thoughts, and this is one of the data-driven innovations that can be brought in. How many of you would have seen the movie Ratatouille? I'm sure many of you have already seen it. In the movie Ratatouille, Chef Gustav has this catchphrase, and what is that? Anybody can cook, right? Well, one of the most interesting questions, probably very, very challenging and a moonshot, is that we are asking in our lab is that of, can computers cook? Well, with the advent of machine learning, text mining, natural language processing, artificial intelligence, it seems like this could be possible. Well, that should not be taken as an insult to a chef's intuition. It's almost like seeing how data science can possibly help us in mimicking the intelligence of chef's intuition. Now, like collecting Shakespeare's sonatas and the literature of Shakespeare, putting it together, putting it under the scanner of data science, of machine learning, of natural language processing, and finding out patterns in them, well, would not be able to at the moment replicate the bard, but we should be able to come up with some interesting patterns that Shakespeare used while writing his literature. In a similar manner, Mozart's of the world, Beethoven's of the world, they are being imitated, replicated in the era of artificial intelligence. Therefore, the question that we are asking in our lab is that, having compiled a large number of recipes with all its subtle nuances that I mentioned to you a little while back, would it be possible for us to understand the grammar of cooking? Would therefore we be able to create a generating function for our recipes, thereby creating recipes on their own from a computer, almost to an extent of creating the Turing test for the chef, such that we can fool an intelligent chef in thinking a recipe which is coming from a computer to be a real recipe, a recipe which is a product of culture and tradition. Well, that's a long shot, definitely, but nothing stops us from dreaming into moving in that direction. So that's another dimension that we are looking at. One more dimension that we have been investigating for a while, and this is, a lot of it is unpublished, therefore I would leave it on the cursory point, is that of the evolution of the cuisine. We have published a couple of papers by now which touch upon the topic of how recipes would have evolved over a long period of time. Starting with a very primitive model, which is called the copy mutate model, we have developed this topic in a direction where we can actually start with a primordial recipe, which is random concoction of ingredients, follow a certain rules, and repeatedly when you apply these rules, you would be able to reach to the present day scenario of recipes, the cuisines which are having a few thousands of recipes in them, starting with a very few number of them at a primordial stage, in a manner that it mimics the statistical properties of the cuisines which are found today. Well, that's what we have done earlier. One of the most exciting thought that keeps me awake in the night these days is that of applying the notion of Darwinian evolution in the context of culture, and specifically that of culinary evolution. So we have been toying out with certain ideas of how do we define the identity of a cuisine in a strictly mathematical and computational sense, and further, how would we be able to compare these cuisines on this notion of identity of a cuisine to be able to come up with a tree which can explain how possibly cuisines have evolved over a period of time, which cuisines have similarities amongst each other and which are different from each other. Well, that's again another long shot, but we believe we are not too far from encoding all the necessary information to be able to come up with the World Culinary Tree, as shown similar to this. This is a primitive data nonetheless, so please don't take this to be the final word on this topic. Now that was about recipes and what can be done in the context of the recipes, compiling this data, searching them, making it available such that we can tweak the existing recipes, coming up with novel recipes, well, and all the way up to letting computers design recipes. In my opinion, we can reach at the in a relatively short period of time, we should be able to reach to a status where chef's intuition is enabled by computers rather than computers cooking on their own new recipes, is what I can imagine it to be coming to a stage. Now the next dimension that we shall be looking at is that of the flavor molecules. Molecules, like I argued in the last class, which are critical for triggering the gustatory and olfactory mechanism, the taste and the odor mechanisms, and thereby being critical for the choice of an ingredient in a recipe. Well, the state of the art of this information was pretty scattered. A lot of ingredients which are used in culinary preparations had been investigated using various chemical methods such as that of gas chromatography, mass spectroscopy, and molecules, especially the aromatic flavor molecules, the taste as well as the odor molecules, had been characterized from a variety of these ingredients, but integration of this wasn't done as we would have liked to do to be able to grow the area of computational gastronomy. So we took this task on our head in our lab, and by spending of the order of around 18 to 20 months on this topic, we have integrated this information of ingredients and their flavor molecules. You would like to visit this website and explore it further. When we come to the topic of flavors, I shall be taking you through the details of this topic in any case. So this is a structured repository of flavor molecules, their natural ingredients in which they are found in, the natural sources from where the ingredient is found in, and further into the chemical space, we have information of the taste and the odor profile of these molecules themselves, apart from a host of chemical properties. Notice that for a data scientist, this is a gold mine. Having got information of flavor molecules, their chemical properties and their physical properties, apart from culinary linkage, that of what ingredient it is part of, and further if you now connect it with which recipe it is being used in, now this is a fantastic resource where we can do a lot of playing around with, and we shall be looking at some of these topics later. After this resource, which was published in Nucleic Acid Research that we created, we realized that for some of our stakeholders, the chefs and the culinary enthusiasts, to be able to use these resource, this needs to be available in a handy, literally handy format. So we created an Android app out of it, and majority of the information which is otherwise available on the website is also made available through this app, which allows you to pair ingredients and find out what are the ingredients that share a lot of molecules amongst each other. This particular app was in fact was launched at the World Heritage Cuisine Summit, and a lot of chefs across the world have been using it, providing us their feedback about what seems to be working and what not. Coming back to the physical property of odor and taste of the molecules and their molecular properties, some of the questions that a typical machine learning scientist or a data scientist would like to ask is that, can we, having got enough amount of data, predict the taste or the odor of a molecule? So I shall be telling you the story of the taste. We looked at a simple notion, relatively simple notion of taste as opposed to the odor, and within that, instead of looking at all the taste dimensions and that of sweet, bitter, salty, sour and umami, we focused on the bitter-sweet axis. We compiled the data of bitter and sweet molecules apart from the tasteless molecules, use them as our labels, and in the presence of a large number of features that were compiled, our idea was to apply the techniques and the tools of machine learning to see whether we can make reliable predictions of the molecules to be bitter or sweet. And this is a published paper now in scientific reports. You may look at the nitty-gritties, and again, as we come to the topic of the taste prediction, I shall be elaborating on this a little later after a few weeks. In a similar manner, one can also be interested, given the interesting problem of uh, the sweet being an important taste attribute and sweetness being an important factor of it. Can we actually predict sweetness for molecules starting with the molecular descriptors is another question that we are tackling in. This is not a solved problem yet, but many other researchers have already worked on it. We are trying to improvise upon it. But what I'm trying to convey you is that in the molecular space, in the flavor space, predicting taste and odor seems to be one of the important agenda that one can work on. Essentially, what I'm presenting to you at the molecular level is the computational food framework, a framework of all kind of food molecules, their physical attributes and their chemical attributes together can be used to redesign food. I'm taking a spoof on an existing paper to title it as the Food Maker's Guide to the Galaxy as opposed to the Drug Maker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is what the original paper was titled as. And I'm suggesting that tools of big data and machine learning can help us, the computational gastronomists, search for the vast chemical universe for better food. The last dimension that I shall be touching upon is that of the health dimension and how it is connected with the diet. The way food interacts with human body, giving rise to health consequences, is way too complex. Human body itself is a very complex entity, and on top of it, food, which is constituting a large number of molecules when consumed, the way it interacts with the body machinery is vastly complex, and thereby coming up with simple notions of a food being good or bad for the health, in my opinion, is rather too trivial. In our lab, what we are trying to do is to work on this aspect from a data-driven perspective to potentially come up with dietary intervention strategies. One of the angle that we have worked on is to ask this question, having figured out that spices are very critical in the Indian cuisine, not to mention even other cuisines also, which we have figured out later. We wanted to know what is the reason that culinary herbs and spices have found space in our kitchen. The existing studies point at a few things. One is a proximate answer, and that is that herbs and spices are used for their aroma. Among the ultimate answers, one of the answers that was presented to us by the Billing and Sherman were that of the fact that herbs and spices tend to have antimicrobial properties, and thereby in these back-to-back papers in 1998 they argued that indeed antimicrobial property could be one of the good reasons why there is a tradition of using herbs and spices in our recipes. In fact, it's very interesting to look at the history of human migration and colonization and trade to see how spices have played a key role on in this whole landscape. And in fact, there used to be a spice route going from the Asian continent to the European and the Middle Eastern regions, right? What we did was to look at the data of published medical literature, the biomedical literature of herbs and spices being associated with positively or negatively with a particular disease term. And by investigating all of these data that we could compile for a few 165 odd herbs and spices, we found that the herbs and spices tend to have broad spectrum benefits across a range of disorders around the mesh hierarchy. Well, on this topic again we shall be touching base with as we come along later, but I definitely wanted to highlight this is one of the computational gastronomy research that has come out of our lab. What we are moving towards is that of creating an exhaustive framework where all kind of food ingredients that are dietary elements and their disease associations as reported on Medline PubMed are compiled and are curated to indicate their positive and negative associations. As of now, our database DietRx has around 2200 and odd ingredients from all kind of categories: the dairy, vegetables, spices, lentils, meat, fish, fruits, flowers, etc. And they being connected to a specific disease term from the medical subject heading, the mesh terminology. And further, we have connected this data with that of external resources, from external resources to that of the chemicals, the genes, and that of the diseases and their interconnections. Among all the linkages which are shown here, the one which we have not explicitly gathered so far is that of the food gene association. Rest of the pairwise associations have been all gathered. Now, DietRx provides an integrated resource and thereby allowing us to mine this data by using algorithms of all sorts, graph theoretical algorithms and other data mining algorithms, to infer meaningful conclusions out of it. All of this, in my opinion, is taking us from a very confused state of not knowing how food interacts with our body and what kind of health impacts it presents to us, to a place where, when a large amount of data is gathered, that of body parameters like the one which are shown here, the gut microbiome, the blood test, the body mass index, and the food diary which is kept over a long period of time. This is a research coming out of Weizmann Institute published in Cell in 2015 December, and a very interesting piece of work where they looked at a very specific physical indicator, and that of increase in glucose post meal, the postprandial glucose level. And by using machine learning techniques, they could correlate the data of body parameters as well as once a certain standardized diet that is consumed by individuals, 800 subjects that were taken for the training of the model, and they could train the model and could reliably come to a couple of conclusions. One, given the same standardized diet, not all people have similar or same response when it comes to the postprandial glucose level, which means that giving a generic advisory of a certain dish or a recipe being good or bad against in this case the postprandial glucose level, which has a strong connection with that of type 2 diabetes, is not a good idea after all. And importantly, they could also figure out that given a standardized diet and body parameters of a particular individual, one could make a very good reliable prediction about what would be the anticipated increase in the glucose level of that individual. Now, this is something which is beyond what one could imagine. But I believe that, like it has happened in other domains of life, where a huge amount of data gathered in conjunction with the power of mathematical and computational techniques can increase our prediction power, which is beyond imagination. In the same manner, in my opinion, the personalized nutrition space is upcoming, and a huge amount of work is needed to be done in this area to come up with predictors of this sort, and for a wide range of health indicators, for a wide range of dietary patterns for different populations, because the responses from population to population, thanks to the genetic as well as environmental factors, could be very different. But we are definitely moving in the direction of personalized nutrition, in my opinion. All of this leads to conclusive points that I would like to make to highlight the United Nations Sustainable Developmental Goals, and in that there are two of them which I would like to highlight. One of them is that of the zero hunger, the goal number 2, and other one is that of good health and well-being. Both of these are connected to food in a very intimate manner, and I strongly believe that in 21st century, computational gastronomy presents the future of the food, and data is definitely the future of the food. Among the techniques and the data-driven innovations that we have developed or in the process of developing include food beverage pairing, design of a new food or a beverage, taste and odor prediction, culinary fingerprinting, dietary interventions with the kind of data that we have, and importantly, sustainable food innovations, so that one can use locally available and seasonably available food ingredients, thereby moving towards a sustainable world and a sustainable food ecosystem. I told you perhaps that I started my journey as an aspiring astronomer. I was trained in the area of physics and computer science before I moved into PhD in computational biology and was specifically focused on biological complex systems. So starting from an aspiring astronomer, moving all the way up to gastronomy has been a journey from astronomy to gastronomy. And I therefore come to realize that this is a quote which I had seen while doing my master's thesis in Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics in Pune, which resonates well with my journey. The discovery of a new dish confers more happiness on humanity than the discovery of a new star. And I serendipitously seem to be on this journey of gastronomy, starting with the notion of astronomy. So that's the end of the first week. We have completed 3 lectures. We shall be moving on to the second week, where we should be looking at recipes data and recipes data analytics. Feel free to respond with queries and questions and comments on the website, the Google Classroom. Avoid sending direct emails unless they are very personal and there is something specific that you would like to convey to me. While I close this particular class, I would like to make an announcement of PhD positions that are available, both supported and unsupported PhD positions in the various areas, computational gastronomy being one of them. And within that, we have various other topics: machine learning, complex networks, data analytical for biomedical applications, etc., in which we are working in this. The kind of skill sets that are expected from a student who expects to join our lab are mentioned below. Please have a look at those. And similarly, I work with a lot of undergraduate students. Most of the work that in fact has happened under the umbrella of computational gastronomy has happened with summer research interns typically. So, and these are the various broad thematic areas in which internships are available around the year, predominantly in the summer, but around the year we do have projects available with us. So consider working on some of these projects, and we shall be considering some of these projects as we go through the course, and consider recommending and forwarding this message to others who might be interested in these topics. So that concludes the week 1 and the last lecture of the week 1. Week 3, we shall be moving into the recipe data analytics, as I said. Don't forget to look at the contents which are shared with you on the Google Classroom. Don't forget to answer the queries and the Google Sheets that have been shared with you. And be prepared, because we shall have a quiz coming up very soon on the first week, covering both the lectures that we have had in the last 2 classes. And we shall move on from there on into the data analytics modules of recipes, followed by which we shall be looking at flavors, and then into the food pairing analysis. So that's the end of the first week, computational gastronomy. We shall meet in the next week. Till then, goodbye.